Hey everyone, welcome back to Miniature Painting 101, the series of videos in which I show you how to paint a miniature from beginning and preparation all the way to the finish. And now we're in part 9, which is what I like to call the painting method and base coating. So you've prepared a miniature and you're ready to paint because it's all ready and primed. So now you're asking yourself, what next? I think it's time to paint. But first, I'd like to go quickly over what I like to call my method of painting, which is very similar to an established method called the 3 color up method, in which you use 3 colors per area of a certain color. And we'll begin with first, the base color, or the foundation color, represented here by Macridge Blue. This is the triad of colors you'd be using to paint an ultramarine space marine, for example. So the base color is meant to establish a foundation, or a base, for the future colors on an area. It's meant to cover the primer and provide a nice base for the other colors. Up next we have a mid-tone highlight. Now this is usually meant to go in all the areas but the recesses, and once again go over the base color and provide some contrast. That way you can see where the light would be hitting the model, for example. And finally, we have the extreme or final highlight. This is typically done on edges or certain surfaces that you really want to stand out on the models. This can be called the edge highlight, the extreme highlight, or just the third highlight color. And as I mentioned, these 3 colors combined form a triad of colors that you would use to paint a specific surface of a miniature. And this also applies to other companies like Reaper or Vallejo. So as I mentioned, we'll start off with the base color for this particular painting series, and it will be Macridge Blue, because we're going to be using to paint an ultramarine space marine during this tutorial. But before we start, I must also mention 2 other types of paints which we'll also be using in these tutorials. The first one is called a shade. Depending on which company you use, they'll be called shades or washes, and these are specifically designed paints that are very thin, and what they do is they get in the recesses or the crevices or the cracks of the miniature, and they provide some really nice contrast and shading to these areas. And what typically you do is you go base coat and then you do the shade, followed by the intermediate highlight or mid-tone highlight, and then the extreme highlight. And we will be covering all these steps in future tutorials. However, there's another type of paint which is called a glaze. Now these do differ from shades or washes, and I will be going over more detail in future videos, but essentially what they do is these specific paints are designed to also be thin, but rather than go into the crevices, they tend to sit on top of your paint, and what they do is they tend to blend all of your paints together and create a really nice blend of colors, and also tone down certain colors. So essentially now you go base color, first to provide the foundation, then a shade, followed by the mid-tone, and then the highlight tone, and finally a glaze to tie them all together. Now this exact process may differ depending which color you're painting or what type of miniature, but this is just a great step-by-step method on how to produce really nice tabletop quality miniatures in little time, especially if you're new to painting. So we'll begin with the first step of the painting method, which is the base coat, which is meant, as I said, to provide a foundation for future colors to highlight over. Now, whenever people tend to base coat their miniatures, and I notice this a lot with new painters, is there tend to be 2 consistent problems with people's base coats. First of all, a very uneven base coat with certain areas being brighter than others, and second, it's too thick, which shows brush marks and obscures the really nice details of the miniature. However, both of these problems can be solved by simply doing multiple coats of thin down paint. Because if you do multiple coats of thin down paint, it'll keep the really nice details, and you can make sure that you get a really nice even coverage of these areas before proceeding to the next steps. So here is our model, all nice and primed. We're going to be painting it in an Ultramarines color scheme, which is kind of the pinnacle of Warhammer 40k. So as I said, we'll be using Macridge Blue. So when preparing my paint, it is a little thick to begin with. So I use a palette, and what I did is I used my brush to collect the paint in the cap, which is the best thing for your brushes, and put it in my palette. And then next, I use some medium thinner to dilute it just slightly to make it a little bit better of a consistency. Now you don't want to go all the way to milk consistency like you would for an airbrush, but just a little bit more watery. Now this would depend on the type of paint, how old it is, and how warm it is in the rooms, because that could dry out your paints quicker. So essentially, as you can see here, I'm just diluting it down to a nice thin coat of paint, and I'll be using this palette to paint the miniature from here on. Now please note that when doing your base coats, you have the option now of base coating all of the areas of the miniature at the same time, or going base coat, shade, highlight for each color, and then after that color is finished, proceed to the next color with base coat, shade, highlight. Either one is great and both have their pros and cons. For this tutorial, I will be just using the armor as the example for painting, and then I will be going over the other areas in future videos where I cover those specific colors or types of paint such as metallics. Now, when diluting your paints, make sure that if they are metallics, do not use water. If they're not metallics, such as this blue, you could get away with using water. I just use a medium because it provides a much nicer dilution to the paint. So as you can see here, I'm simply using a very standard sized brush, not a lot of paint on it, and I'm just simply covering the areas with a nice thin coat of this Macridge blue paint. Since pretty much all of the armor is going to be blue and just certain areas are going to be raised above it, you can actually get away with painting pretty much the entire miniature minus the gun this Macridge blue, and then later going over with highlights of these areas with the other colors, since the other colors will be going on top of it. As I recommend, when painting a miniature, start from the inside layer and work your way outwards. If one color goes on top of another one, do that one second, because it's much easier to go over that one later than to go first with one color and then the one that goes beneath it. And I will be describing this more in future videos if you're having any questions about this. So as you can see here, I'm just going, as I said, just going over the areas with relative ease, just giving a nice, even coat. Now the key is even and with a nice thin coat, because then no brush marks will be seen, and you're going to see all of the details will still be intact when this model is dry. And that's the key to preserving some nice details and a great base coat for your miniature. Also, when base coating miniatures such as this one, and since I'm going to cover most of the armor, you can get away with using a pretty much as large of a brush as you really want. I'm just going with a more standard size, smaller brush just to show you the details of painting it. So, as you can see, I'm just going around the entire miniature and giving all of the areas this Macridge blue base coat. And remember, and once you start painting an area, for example, if I've already painted the helmet, even if I notice it's a little uneven now, I will not go and repaint over it until the paint is completely dry. This is a very easy way of ruining a base coat, and it'll end up showing, if part of the paint is partly dry and you try to paint over it, what essentially you'll do is you'll crack the top layer, and this will show your brush strokes on the miniature. And it's up to you, as I mentioned in previous videos, of what color primer you want to use. I just went black because it's very simple. And now that it's done, the key is now let the first coat dry entirely. Make sure it is 100% dry before proceeding to the second coat if you need one. Now this will depend on the type of paint you use, what you use to thin it down, and also the atmosphere of the room. Is it a really warm room? Is it a really moist room? And so forth. Just make sure it is completely dry before proceeding to the second base coat and from each step to the next one. So now that the miniature is completely dry, I'm just going to give it one more very quick coat of this diluted paint, and this will ensure that it's a really nice solid foundation of blue to go over in future steps. So because you guys have already seen this, once again, I will speed it up. As you can see, I'm focusing on the entire miniature, but especially areas that maybe the first coat really did not cover too well. It is a little difficult going over a light blue color over a black primer, But as I said, 2 very quick coats of this paint and you couldn't tell the difference. And as I mentioned, it's up to you now if you want it. After doing the base coat on this color, you could then further do the base coats on each other color, such as the gold areas, the reds, and the metallics. Or you can completely finish the blue before proceeding to the next color. Either one has their pros and cons. One of them will keep your brush always moving, and it will always be painting the miniature. The only downside is, though, you can actually get your colors to bleed into one another if they're wet at the same time. So it's up to you. As you see, I'm just going over the back area, and after the second coat, it is really nice coverage, and you can't see any brush strokes. And plus, all of the really nice details, specifically the cracks and crevices of the armor, are still very visible on the miniature. And then once again, after this step was complete, I let it dry completely again. And here's what the miniature looked like after the base coat. As you can see, a great color base coat. It's completely covered the primer in all the areas that matter, and all of the details are well preserved with no brush strokes. So this is the ideal base coat. So thank you very much for watching this part of Miniature Painting 101, and stay tuned for the next part, which I will be going over the next step, which are the washes or shades, which will provide some really nice depth of color and bring out some of those details on this miniature. So till next time, this is Jay saying, happy painting, everyone.